Imagine this scenario. A man is gunned down by police officers. The man, who lab reports would confirm is high on methamphetamines and PCP, pointed a pistol at the officers and ignored repeated orders to drop the weapon. The police were initially called to the scene by concerned motorists who the 6'6", 330-pound man was harassing and threatening as they drove by. The man also had multiple warrants out for his arrest. The entire altercation was captured from multiple body cameras as well as a helicopter camera and confirmed by eyewitnesses. The police officers were commended by the department for their appropriate escalation of force and adherence to the rules of engagement. The next day, protesters took to the streets in force, demanding the officers be imprisoned for life. The mother of the deceased, who was nowhere near the vicinity of the shooting, insists that the evidence was planted, the witnesses coached, and the footage doctored. The nation has rallied behind the mother demanding justice. An angelic photo of the victim is being circulated, who has been described by the mother as a sweet boy who wouldn't hurt anyone. The President of the United States is calling the incident a tragedy. Civil rights groups are calling it a nationwide wake-up call on police brutality. Oh, I forgot to mention the victim was black. Does it make sense now? Because it shouldn't. In this series, we're going to look at how the media and social media is presenting black people who have been killed by the police versus what actually happened in those killings. The reason I'm doing this is because I'm seeing lists of black victims circulating on the internet being used as proof of injustice. They're throwing a bunch of names at you so that you will be so overwhelmed you won't bother to look at the individuals on the list. But in a lot of these cases, the killings were either justified or mere accidents. So I thought I'd break them all down one at a time, starting with Michael Brown. I've been hearing the city of Ferguson so many times lately as a symbol of racial injustice that I often wonder if we're talking about the same Ferguson. It's only been 6 years and we're already forgetting what actually happened. How long before the facts are forgotten and we're just going along with whatever narrative they were being told? So let's look at Michael Brown. How the media reported it. According to the media and social media, there was a brief misunderstanding between Michael Brown and a police officer before Michael Brown ran away, and after he was shot in the back, he turned around, put his hands in the air, yelled, "Don't shoot," and was gunned down mercilessly in the street from quite a distance, signifying that the officer was not under any threat. Michael Brown, dubbed the Gentle Giant and called a child, was murdered in cold blood by a racist cop who is still not in prison. Kamala Harris said we must fight for stronger accountability and racial equity in our justice system. Elizabeth Warren said, 5 years ago, Michael Brown was murdered by a white police officer in Ferguson, Missouri. Michael was unarmed, yet he was shot 6 times. Blah, 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 fight for justice. We must confront systemic racism and police violence head on. This idea that he was unarmed is stated many, many times. AP News, who is usually pretty objective when it comes to reporting, especially compared to others, had it framed as though a passing police officer was just driving by when a white officer confronted Brown, who was black. They make sure to point that out. Situation escalated. That's not very descriptive. It just escalated. There was some scuffling before the officer shot and killed Brown, who was unarmed. The person who was walking with Michael Brown testified that the officer chased after Brown, fired into Mike Brown's back. At that point, he turned around with his hands up, unarmed, told him to stop shooting, and the officer fired several more times. This witness claims that the police officer was chasing after Brown and shooting at the same time.
And then what happened?
Got out his man and just started chasing after the boy. I'm hearing shots fired. Clearly none of them hit him, but one I think did graze him, as they say on the autopsy report. And at the end, he just turned around after, I'm guessing, he felt the bullet graze his arm. He turned around and then was shot multiple times. And
she also claimed that the police officer was trying to pull Michael Brown into his cruiser.
Okay, well, from my point of view, I could not tell exactly what was going on, but it just looked as if he was trying to pull him almost into the car.
Who pulled? The officer pulled Michael into
Brown.
The car.
It just looks like he was trying to do such, and Brown being a bigger fella, that didn't seem to have been working, so of course he got away, and it just seemed to have upset the officer.
Here's another witness that claims the officer was chasing after Michael Brown while firing his weapon. Brown turned around with his hands up and was gunned down.
Michael breaks away and he starts running away from the officer. The officer gets out of his vehicle and pursues Michael as he's shooting his weapon. Michael jerks his body as if he was hit, then he turns around, faces the officer, and puts his hands up, and the officer continues to shoot him until he goes down to the ground.
They claim that Michael Brown was a fair distance away from the police officer when he was killed, mainly judging by how far he was from the cruiser. It's obvious that this child, this gentle giant, was gunned down by a racist cop. Except, what actually happened? Despite the media insisting on showing this photo of Michael Brown, an innocent child listening to some music, this was actually Michael Brown. Seen here stealing Swisher Sweet cigars and then assaulting the store owner when confronted about them. That's weird. I thought this was an innocent child that was shot. Hands in the air, don't shoot became a symbol for black people everywhere, from celebrities to pro athletes, for police brutality and racism. The problem is the police weren't brutal and it wasn't a question of racism. Mike Brown had just robbed a convenience store and physically harassed the owner. He and his partner in crime were walking down the middle of the street when the police, responding to the robbery call, showed up. The officer identified Brown from the description of the robber and ordered him and his friend to move to the sidewalk. When the officer tried to exit his squad car, Brown slammed the door shut from the outside. Brown then attacked the officer through his car window, punched him, and tried to grab his gun. This is supported by several eyewitnesses and the 2 shell casings and bullet holes found in the car. Brown's DNA was also found on the gun and inside of the car. His hat was on the ground outside the car. His blood was found on the outside of the vehicle. 1 bullet grazed Brown's thumb. Brown had powder in the wound, which could only occur if his hand was inches from the gun when it went off. The officer, Darren Wilson, was not trying to pull a 6'4", 292-pound man into his car. That would be stupid. What is his plan with pulling a giant person through a window? What's your next step there? Here's a picture of the incident that was shown at the trial. Despite what the witnesses said, there were no shell casings besides the 2 right outside the vehicle and the 10 where the shooting occurred. He could not have been running down the street firing like they said. 3 autopsies showed that he was never hit in the back, so he couldn't have been hit in the back to turn around. There were 4 wounds to his right arm and 2 to his head. The one that went in his eye exited out his clavicle area, which means it was a downward trajectory. The fatal shot went through the top of his head, which again could have only occurred if Brown was coming toward the officer and bent over. So only 2 situations could have occurred. Either Brown charged at the officer, or Brown was shot and then stumbled forward and continually shot. But people who are shot in the front don't stumble forward. It knocks them backwards. Also, the picture shows Brown's body was 21 feet from the initial bloodstains. Someone stumbling forward from a gunshot would not stumble 21 feet. Also, the bloodstain pattern in the shell casings showed that Wilson was actually retreating while firing. There were a lot of witness reports in this case. Most of them were dismissed because they were deemed uncredible since they didn't match up with the evidence or the videos at all. One of the ones that was deemed credible reported that Brown turned and ran at the officer like a bull. Wilson also claimed that Brown reached into his waistband as though he were grabbing for a gun. This could be chalked up as police bullshit, except for the fact that another witness said that Brown grabbed at his pants like he were pulling them up, and the medical examiner says that Brown's hand was near his waistband. The jury had several black people in it. Several credible black witnesses agreed with Wilson, saying he was in the right, did what he had to do, said that Brown charged Wilson, said that Wilson fired in self-defense, said that Wilson's life was in danger, denied that Brown ever held his hands up in surrender. These people were also afraid of telling the truth because of the neighborhood backlash that might come. In fact, many of the witnesses who spoke against Wilson admitted to lying after the prosecution questioned them. Even Brown's friend Dorian Johnson changed his statement to say that Brown technically had his hands up, but they weren't really in the air because he had already been shot. Despite all of this, Michael Brown is still used as evidence of police brutality and racism. Don't get me wrong, and a lot of these cases have me looking like this. But in most of these cases, including Michael Brown, I only feel like this.
Stop breaking the law, asshole!
Alright, that ends that. To keep from being accused of bias, I think I'll switch back and forth between killings where the cop is at fault and killings where the victim is at fault. So next video, we'll look at the undeniable murder of Walter Scott.